With many other things, like this. Yeah, I'm a Nalgene girl myself. Even my kids are like. You have chocolate as well.
My first.
They clearly brought it up, and I was like, yeah. Mine are 8 to 10. Oh, no, I haven't done a little bit.
Same here.
I don't know if you're familiar with South End. They just posted about you like the other day. There at some point, but I was like, oh, it's fun.
The South-Denver Food Group is,
Whatever they call it.
I think that's it. Sorry. Sometimes it's hard for us to make inroads in there because we're vegan. They're like, yeah. But
Right, I don't understand, like, I think
you're like, people are eating vegan accidentally.
Yeah. Right, right. Right. Yeah.
They do like, I love when this happens, maybe programs. Do not have that.
I can.
Good to see everyone. I got a really. Okay, yeah.
Thanks for sharing that with the group. Anyone? Yes.
And what was included. Have to engage with us. We're having to go to the end. Thank you. All right, so.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, so select the speaker on the speaker phone. I just have to say this is good.
Turn it off. This. And this is what you all agree to. Will you feel comfortable with this, but Cedar? Sustainable, one of them.
Sustainable, affordable, accessible, effective.
It's nice to put on paper, but it's also common.
Landlords know that there's more options out there for the. For sale, for owner, goes up. It's the whole answer over the course of the whole year. So I don't mind having a little,
question to me, how are people like working at Home Depot? How are they affording to pay rent without working 2 jobs?
That's right.
Because it's not supposed to be about always working, work to pay your bills and just getting by. It's about putting money aside for your future, for your retirement, for investments. So with this sitting the way it is right now, and people not making that kind of money, how are they gonna put away for their future? And that's my concern. I'm looking for the next generation of renters and owners in the city, in the state, not just in Englewood, because I believe that they're gonna probably use this as an example for other cities here in the state of Colorado. And I find this concerning, because not a lot of people are making that kind of money.
Okay, so we thank you for this discussion. The design team and I will continue to work this through so that we can present a new draft, a revised draft for you all to consider, with the intention of getting closer or being spot on with what you're describing. So I really, really appreciate you pausing and questioning and seeking more clarity. We're gonna get there. And we're gonna get there because technology will work. Okay. Now for the most exciting part to me, hopefully to all of you, is we've got some guests that are going to speak and present to us. Perhaps some of these questions will be answered. I certainly will be taking notes on questions that you all ask. And I'll be thinking about how what's presented will help inform some of these definitions that we're asking about as well. But we are here to hear about, has everyone heard enough? Probably not about Prop 123, because you're going to hear a lot more to provide some clarity. And so we've got Mollie Fitzpatrick, co-founder of and managing director of the Root Policy Research. Mollie, thank you.
Great, yes, thank you, appreciate it.
And there is,
I'll see if I can make the clicker work, and I'm gonna have my computer up here so I can cheat if I need to answer hard questions. Oh, perfect. All right, thank you for the introduction. I know I've seen some of your faces before, but some of them not. So just as a quick introduction, I'm Mollie Fitzpatrick. As she said, I'm managing director of Root Policy Research. We are a Denver-based economic and policy firm that works specifically in housing policy solutions for local governments. So all of our clients are local governments, and we do a lot of economic analysis around housing markets, but then also help with strategic planning and policy solutions to address where that market may not be functioning like we'd like it to. We work all over the country, but we do a ton of work in the Denver metro and really across Colorado because we're based here and you like working in our backyard for sure. So, so we helped out, or we conducted the housing needs assessment, which was conducted at sort of alongside or at the same time as Code Next was moving forward. Part of our analysis was designed just to help the city really understand what the housing needs are and where they fall, and also look forward towards some policy recommendations to help address those needs. Embedded in some of those policy recommendations was also specific, I guess, recommendations for Code Next, both around like what types of housing are needed, but also looking at affordability incentives. So I know that came up already, the incentives and inclusionary. We did some specific modeling for the Code Next team around what incentives might work and where they might not work as well. And so that was really our role as part of this project. The housing needs assessment, which some of you have probably seen, was delivered last year. And so most of the data that I have that I'm going to show you go through 2020. I realize that feels like a long time ago, you know, from a housing market perspective, I can kind of speak anecdotally to where things have kind of continued, but for the most part, they've kind of continued on a similar trajectory since that time, other than interest rates, which we'll talk about as part of the affordability conversation today as well. Did you figure out where to point it? Oh, no, and then over here. Maybe this is my, all right, great. I'm gonna kind of glance through this. You guys have talked about a lot of this already, so I'm not gonna belabor it with different words either. And I think, I mean, bottom line, the reason we think about housing is because it impacts so many other things, right? It impacts the economy, it impacts household dynamics, it impacts long-term stability of children and their earning potential and all of those things. And that's why we think about it as something that public sector should think about in terms of local government and in terms of policies as well. I'm gonna do a quick kind of key terms. I wasn't sure kind of what all you had talked about already as a group. It sounds like you've covered AMI. Lindsay obviously is an expert on that front as well. So just acknowledging kind of that we use those terms a lot. And so those will be popping up, but I won't go through them since you've already talked about them as well. I do want to kind of clarify a couple of other terms that I will use. When I say missing middle, I'm generally talking about housing types. Sometimes people say missing middle and they're talking about incomes. They're talking about like, oh, we don't have any missing middle housing that serves middle income. But technically, when I talk about missing middle, it's really like a planning jargon that's really referring to like duplexes, townhomes, courtyard apartments, kind of the stuff that's in between a single family home and a giant apartment complex. So when I say missing middle, that's what I mean. Affordable housing, you guys have already talked a little bit about the definition of affordable housing. When we say affordable, it does mean sort of that 30% of income goes to housing. There's both naturally occurring affordable housing, so stuff that's just like happens to be affordable to the person that is in it. And then there's also income or deed restricted housing, which means it's got some sort of contractual mechanism that makes it affordable to those households. That could be, for example, some of Lindsay's properties around like when there's HUD money involved and it's contractually affordable. It can also be something like Habitat for Humanity, so a nonprofit, but that has a certain restriction on that. And then when we're talking data, the geographic area of analysis is the city of Englewood in the data that I'm going to present. We did do some peer communities as well. These AMIs, as you already noted, apply to the whole region, but the data that we're looking at are Englewood specific when we're looking at housing prices. So we're going to cut to chase. We're going to talk through top housing needs. We're talking about some of the recommendations, and then I'm going to give just a little bit about kind of what's been going on since we made these recommendations. And then I'll also hand it over to John to talk about Prop 123, which is kind of tied to some of those outcomes as well. But I like to do the spoilers first. So these are the top housing needs, and then we'll look at the data that show you why we think these are the top housing needs in Englewood specifically. Broadly speaking, these needs that we identified center around affordability, diversity, and stability for households. So when we look at these, the first one is just diverse housing options to accommodate evolving needs of residents and a wider array of market preferences and special needs. I know that sounds a little generic and kind of jargony, but broadly speaking, housing preferences are shifting, not in a converging manner, but in a diverging manner, which means we have somebody mentioned aging households that are looking for both affordable, but also potentially somewhere that would accommodate mobility challenges. We have a lot of different preferences around walkability or bikeability, or no, I still want a really big yard. And so we're just seeing, broadly speaking, in the market, a divergence of preferences, and that requires a divergence or more diversity in what housing types and even property types accommodate both those preferences, but also needs in terms of affordability. Number two, additional affordable rentals, or that can also be in the form of rental assistance. For residents earning less than 50% AMI. I'll show you why we think that's where the most acute need is below 50% AMI, specifically for renters. Third is starter homes. So affordability for renters, also affordability for folks looking to convert from renting into owning. And we really felt like the price point, based on the data that we were seeing, 300,000 was about the mark where there was just like nothing, not enough to accommodate the level of demand. That generally, the most acute need was below 80% AMI. We did see some needs in the market all the way up to 120% AMI, just when we're looking at mismatches between incomes of people that either have historically been able to buy or would like to buy and what the market is offering. So I know you guys are kind of thinking about where do we want to tailor some of our strategies, and hopefully some of the data that we show will give you some guidance for that. I'll also just caveat that as you think about tapping into state and federal resources, That's where AMI starts to play a little bit of a role as well. So when you think about Prop 123 money, and John will talk about this, there are certain AMI targets for ownership programs and rental programs that you have to hit to be in compliance with that. So that's something to consider as well as you all are thinking about strategy. And then finally, just additional housing resources to stabilize households with either unique or disproportionate housing needs. That includes people with accessibility or mobility needs, so folks with disability, older adults, low-income households, and people experiencing homelessness. This bullet, it captures a lot of different populations. The goal here is to acknowledge, look, you need units that are priced affordably for renters and owners. You also need some specific tailored programs that might be uniquely designed for supportive services or accessibility improvements or adding ramps to homes where folks have stairs and they can't get in. So thinking about kind of what those programmatic supports might be to help provide housing for those folks. Perfect. So housing structure, it sounds like you guys have talked about this a little bit already. This just compares kind of the distribution of the types of houses that you have in Englewood to the rest, to a handful of communities throughout the metro. About half your housing stock is single family detached. About a third of it is attached multifamily. So with it has a building that has at least 10 units. Not a ton, just 14%, but then that kind of like missing middle housing type. So that are row home, townhouses, duplexes as well. That's not uncommon. That's usually kind of the smallest bar throughout here. You're not super far off some of your neighbors, but you are below some of your other neighbors. So you're about on par with Centennial, a little higher than Sheridan, but you're a little behind Littleton and Lakewood on that front, and a little behind kind of the more regional comparison there.
You said greater than 10 units, you mean less than 10 units?
Sorry, yeah, the gray bar is a building that's got more than 10 units. I'm sorry, yeah, the missing middle is a building that's got fewer than 10 units. When we look at rents rose a lot. Probably most of you know that. And this is just showing between 2010 and 2020. This is showing the number of rental units kind of in each of those rent buckets. Right? And so the gray line is 2010. The yellow line is 2020. You can see in 2010, you had a pretty good number here between 500 and 1,000. And most of those went away. You did actually raise here, but in this like 500 to 800 in particular, you lost a whole lot of stock. This is not adjusted for inflation because we like to look at incomes separate from housing prices and then compare those two. It's a little bit, there's a lot of economic nerdiness that goes into that. But bottom line, this rent increase is much higher than inflation was. So this is not just a reflection of, oh yeah, well, like inflation went up and everyone's incomes went up. This is significantly higher than inflation. It's also significantly higher than earnings and how much they will have as well. For sale, also a pretty steep line. You can see here, the yellow line is Englewood, and this really just kind of compares housing prices starting all the way back at the year 2000. So at that point in time, you know, the median, like the middle, right in the middle, was just under 200,000. And we stayed pretty flat through here. We didn't have a huge dip in the Great Recession like the US did. So US is this gray line. You can see a little bit more of a peak, a little bit more of a drop, and a steadier climb. And so we had a pretty flat recession and then just really spiked up. So this goes through 2022. Trends in 2023 kind of leveled off, but interest rates went up so much that the purchasing power dropped significantly, right? And so you think about kind of incomes, and if they were generally rising, they kind of try to keep up, and interest rates were really low. So even if people's incomes weren't keeping up, interest rates kind of let people stay like in the market, like hanging on, kind of in terms of entering the market. Right about here, if you're plotting kind of the trajectory of purchasing power, of what people can actually buy, it just goes and takes a huge nosedive because interest rates went from 3% to 7%. And prices did not respond to those interest rates by going down. So generally in economics, we think if interest rates are going to jack up, then housing prices will level off. And that didn't happen, or it hasn't happened yet. And we don't think it's going to happen in any real significant way. We do think that line is going to moderate in terms of prices, but it's not going down, even though interest rates are still high. We also do an analysis called a housing gaps analysis, and this is kind of what drives some of those those key, summary figures that say, look, here's what we think affordability needs are in the rental market, and here's, we think those are below 50% AMI, and in the ownership market, we think they're kind of in this 80-120. This is the analysis that drives that. There is a more detailed look at this in the report, but this is probably detailed. This is probably too detailed anyway. So if you want to dig deeper, you certainly can. Broadly speaking, what we do in this analysis is it's not looking at how many new units you need to build. It's looking at where you have a mismatch between what people can afford based on who lives in Englewood right now. So we're talking about just your current residents and how well their incomes line up with your housing prices. So where is your market broken, essentially, for the people that already live here? So and when we're talking about adding jobs, we're talking about adding residents, that's even on top of some of these affordability needs. This is really looking at where those affordability mismatches. And we look at that first in the rental market. What we do is we say, okay, how many renters are there in each of these income categories? What can they afford to pay for rent if they're spending 30% of their household income on rent? And then how many units are in those affordability categories, right? And we just take the difference of kind of that supply. So what rental units exist and the demand of how many people want those units. And so you can see kind of starting at the top there in that rental market gap. That shows you the total number of renters that you have that earn about 30% AMI or less. So you've got about 2,300 folks that are in that income range, but there's only 700 units in the entire city, including subsidized units that perfectly line up with that affordability. And so in terms of affordability, you've got a gap there between what people can afford and what exists. When we look at less than 50% AMI, so that includes all those people in the 30% AMI bucket and adds a few more on that are in that 30 to 50 range. You go to 3,700 renters that are less than 50% AMI, and these are ballpark numbers, and they're from about 2020. So Lindsay may have more updated numbers for you, but when we did this analysis with 3,700, and then units in that price range was about 2,900, so about an 800 unit gap. That means we see the gap is bigger, obviously 30% AMI. Those folks are just paying more than they can afford on their housing. And that's what's happening with these gaps. These people aren't on the streets, they're not without a unit, but these folks are paying a lot more than they can afford for their rent. That leads to a lot of instability. It sort of feeds the pipeline into homelessness. It also feeds the pipeline into other more detrimental kind of household function and household situations. And not to mention stress. We do kind of a similar analysis on the for sale. We're looking at who might be first-time home buyers and what their income looks like. So we're actually looking at current renters. We start with we kind of ignore the folks that are less than 30% AMI. That's not historically a home buying income level. So we start with 30 to 80. And broadly speaking, you had about 38% of renters are in this income range of 30 to 80% AMI, and only 2% of the homes that were listed or sold in the prior year to this analysis were in that price range. So really acute needs there. And even when we go up to 120% AMI, still a really big gap between folks that might like to buy a home and be trying to position to do that, and the number and proportion of homes that are sold. So I know it's a lot of data. Happy to answer questions about that if you have it. But I do want to kind of jump to recommendations. So acknowledging kind of all those needs that we talked about at the beginning and some of the data that feeds those, these are the recommendations. Oh, I jumped. Thought it was my recommendations. I'm not. First, before I show you the recommendations, which you probably already read, I just want to kind of acknowledge that this is how we think about housing strategy and the types of ways to address these needs. One is funding. Obviously, putting money into this is going to be necessary at certain income levels. So when you think about kind of more like, safety net housing or folks that are in that 0 to 30% AMI, the market is never going to build that, no matter how much you deregulate and allow for it. The market cannot do it. That is why we have subsidies at that level. Lindsay, I know, has talked a lot about those subsidies, LIHTC, HUD funds. There's some state funds available. We're seeing more and more local jurisdictions contribute to that as well. So funding is always going to be needed, particularly at the lowest income levels. Building housing is another solution. Broadly speaking, there's lots of ways to do that. And that doesn't mean the city has to build it. All of these require partnerships. That may mean making your zoning code a little bit less regulated so that more market rate housing can be built. It may mean, putting some gap financing in, low-income housing tax credits, those types of things. Preservation, Englewood has a lot of relatively affordable housing just in the market compared to some of your neighbors, right? It doesn't feel that way all the time, the folks that are trying to buy a house, but compared to your neighbors, you've got some existing, that's actually both in the ownership market, also in the rental market. So just keeping an eye on ways to make sure that you can preserve that the market doesn't just kind of steal that away from you. And sometimes that means adding a subsidy to it. Sometimes it just means how to make sure that we're protecting these from, kind of a variety of ways they can exit. And then assistance, this is kind of back to that program approach. So thinking about how do we get residents access to services and programs that may help increase their stability. So when we think about recommendations, we're thinking about kind of how do we do a little bit of all of these. There's not a silver bullet in housing, there's not a silver bullet in anything, but thinking about a combination of approaches that allow for all of these, or at least help you check out some of these is generally ideal. So now to the actual recommendations in terms of what came out of our study that we recommended. I don't think is that actually adopted by city council, or I don't know, it's just sort of a framework for recommendations, which can hopefully, oh yes, you can tell us.
City council responded by putting together this task force. Truly, to look at these proposed recommendations and then select what are the ones that you all want to consider then to recommend back to city council. So that's our process.
Great, thank you. So these are the actions that you guys should pay attention to, obviously, because you haven't decided what to do. Great. So I'll just give you kind of a quick walkthrough, and then we're going to talk about a couple of these that are kind of already moving forward, including obviously this task force is kind of an outcome of that as well. Number one, just adopt a local affordable housing goal. So think about what do we want to do and how can we get there. Prop 123 helps set that from a numerical perspective. This task force is obviously setting a vision for that. So this can kind of be qualitative and quantitative. Y'all are the qualitative. And John is going to talk a little bit about the quantitative in terms of Prop 123. Create a dedicated revenue source to address housing challenges. Having something that automatically goes to housing is a huge benefit for supporting programs, supporting affordable housing development. And we're even seeing as the state adds more resources, they are also asking local communities to match in order to get access to some of those resources. And so this becomes important, not just in terms of funding affordable housing and funding some of your solutions, it also becomes important for leveraging state and federal dollars. So it's something to think about in terms of how do we build that source. There's lots of ways to do that. Sometimes it's just a general fund allocation. Sometimes it's a tax that goes through people to decide. There's also fees and kind of a variety of ways that people are looking at that in terms of dedicated revenue. But that's one of the benefits. It's not just the money, it's also leveraging other dollars. The next two are both zoning code related. So we'll talk about how Code Next has already addressed those to some extent. But number three, updating the zoning code to reduce barriers for more diverse housing types, so more types of housing, as we talked about before. And then number four, codifying development incentives for affordable housing. So we talk about, I think you guys have talked about it already, but basically like what carrots can we offer developers to get them to do what we'd like them to do or deliver the outcomes that we want? What can we give them from a development standpoint that helps them create more affordable housing? Number five has come up already in this meeting. So consider an inclusionary zoning ordinance with incentives and offsets. Talk briefly about that and some work that we've already done around kind of feasibility on that in just a moment. And then six is allocate publicly owned land and or strategically acquire vacant or utilized properties for affordable and mixed income. I do want to kind of caveat, publicly owned doesn't just mean city owned. It can also mean, the state landlord has land here, or RTD has a parcel that they're not using, or kind of any of those others. Sometimes in school districts, for example, Jeffco is obviously consolidating a handful of schools, and then there's folks looking at which of those parcels might work well for affordable development as well. So publicly owned doesn't just mean city owned, though it can mean city owned too. Seven, support acquisition and rehab that creates or preserves affordable housing. It's possible that Lindsay talked a little bit about that with some programs, but maybe not. There's a handful of nonprofits that do this. Housing authorities can do this as well, but it generally requires a funding source. because it's not cheap to acquire a building, and then income restrict the whole thing, right? So you're taking generally what's an aging property that has a ton of deferred maintenance, and you're saying, and we wanna keep the rents way down here, right? And so that's gonna require a subsidy, but it is a important and critical way to keep what you have in terms of aging multifamily that may be serving kind of naturally occurring affordability right now, and probably is. And you've got landlords that it may be sort of their retirement, and they're saying like, I'm ready to cash out, and I'm gonna sell to this developer that's gonna luxury those units. Or if the city can bring funding or another nonprofit can bring funding, you can keep those kind of in that affordable range. So that's a really important one too. 8, improve access to regional programs, and if possible, also those local resources. Denver metro area has a ton of nonprofits that serve the whole metro. There's lots of down payment assistance programs. There's like rehab programs. There's a good number. Chappa's got a ton of programs. But we often find that residents have no idea who they're eligible for a ton of those. And so we really find that like just making folks aware, even city staff, frontline service workers, all the people, and making it super clear like on your website what your residents might be eligible for. It goes a long way. And they continue to advocate for regional collaboration and partnership development. There's a lot of that happening right now. Some of that's legislative, some of that's not legislative. Dr. Cox doing a big study that's housing related for the entire region. You've got Denver kind of does a lot of times its own thing, but you will already have a history of collaborating with some of the other South Metro suburbs around homelessness plans. Jefferson County is looking to collaborate more with its partners and folks in kind of around the county as well. So there's lots of opportunity to do this, and just being aware of some of those and trying to do that as well. So I mentioned kind of briefly, this is the same list, not another list, so I'm not adding anything to it, promise. But I mentioned briefly, like kind of where you are on a couple of these, so just kind of recap that. On the affordable housing goal, like you all are developing that right now, and then there's some numbers to go with it that John will talk about on Prop 123. Those zoning code and development incentives are code next. I'm going to go on the next time, I'm going to show you exactly what code next did in terms of kind of how it relates to housing. Code next, obviously, planning gets real complicated, and I'm not a planner, I'm an economist, and I don't read planning codes, so we're gonna go to a real summary level on what code next did, but it's not sure, and I can point to my planner friends in the room if I need to. And then inclusionary zoning, I do want to acknowledge, and maybe some of you have seen that report as well. We did a feasibility analysis, which basically is a fancy term for like, does this work? Kind of analysis. We looked at both incentives and inclusionary. Our kind of conclusion based on that study was we recommended some specific incentives in Code Next. We also said, look, we do think inclusionary is viable. It's not going to kill your market. You have a market that would support inclusionary. Inclusionary being a requirement to build affordable units anytime you build something new. And so we think your market would support that. We do think inclusionary is more likely to generate affordable units than incentives. That's true in almost every market. That inclusionary, where you have to do it, is going to develop more units than incentives, where you're like, will we do this? Because within inclusionary, you can give the same incentives. You can give the same offsets. It makes developers more inclined to not complain about it, basically. But you can offer those incentives either under the requirement or under incentives. Inclusionary generally delivers more, but it's politically really challenging because a lot of developers don't push back. But we do sort of recommend that you keep considering it and just kind of acknowledge some of those trade-offs. Most of the trade-offs are political trade-offs. So is this going to get us, enough units to be worth the pain of kind of pushing through on what can be a challenging policy to pass. That said, Littleton passed it last year with not a lot of challenge. And so we are seeing more and more communities passing these. There's a handful in the Denver Metro, Bennett and Littleton. It would be a great example to look to because they really said, look, this is a priority and we don't think it's going to kill development and we're just going to push it through. They tailored their policy to make sure that it wasn't going to be a huge burden on developers to hit, but they would also generate revenue and money for the city. So with that, quick recap on kind of code next and how it relates to the housing policies that we talked about, and then I hand over to John for take questions. But basically, in terms of increasing housing diversity, Codex did kind of increase the opportunity for ADUs, small lot homes, and both kind of that missing middle 2 and 4 unit, as well as 5+ unit buildings. It didn't say you can use these everywhere, obviously, but it did increase kind of the opportunity for those. It also added incentives for affordable and attainable housing. Those incentives where you get to build higher buildings if you include affordable, and you don't have to have as many parking spaces. Parking, there are actually reductions on parking for a variety of housing types, not just for affordable, but for affordable, you get bigger parking discounts as well. The parking standards anymore were really, really high. Parking code next, that was creating a barrier to just multi-family being built in general, and for even some of that missing middle stuff being built, parking was really constrained. So kind of just right sizing parking with what the market wants out of parking right now, so you don't end up with a bunch of extra places as well. So that's kind of a recap on the policy summary on code next. Some of you are probably pretty familiar with that or maybe followed it. I'm happy to take any questions. So, yes.
It sounds like Denver has been breaking ground on a lot of really great affordable multifamily projects, like one by Ruby Hill, who's reading about it, and some other ones. Do you know exactly how the finances work on all those? Is that all from Englewood fees for their IHO, or?
It's not all. Some of it's LIHTC, so low income housing tax credits. Some of it's Denver Housing Authority as well, although they typically use low income housing tax credits to do the development. But the city does contribute a good bit of funding to that. So the city has dedicated funding for that, including its inclusionary, its fee in lieu. It is even prior to enacting its current inclusionary, it was collecting impact fees on affordable housing essentially. Or linkage fees, they're sometimes called in affordable housing. So they also have a sales tax that's dedicated to housing. So a lot of it's being funded through that. There's also some nonprofits that are they're active and they're funding those as well. So it depends on the specific one. Most of the ones that are going to build are have it either, and most of them have some combination of funding. So state, some local, and low income housing tax credit for the most part. That's how the majority of them get. Any other questions? Yeah.
Oh, just out of curiosity, what were the parking requirements and what are they now, or what will they be?
Brad?
I can't recite them off the top of my head in terms of numbers. We can do some follow-up and get that back to you, but generally the idea was what Mollie said is our parking requirements prior to the new code were pretty extravagant in terms of the modern day construct of multi-family housing. So we were constantly having the road commission to talk about what made more sense. And they across the board came down, but they also came down more if development would do those affordable units, because that drives their cost down instead of boosting the specific more affordable for them to build and for people. We get to the specific numbers.
Yeah, I'm kind of looking at a couple of notes. These may not be super precise, but it did scale by bedroom as well. And so if you build a 2-bedroom, you have to build more parking spaces. Prior, at least on the 1-bedroom and studio units, you guys were requiring 1.5 spaces per unit, and I think it dropped down to 1. But now let's see where the other ones are. At least the quick notes.
With a very big conversation around off-street parking for ADUs.
Yeah.
As ADUs in Fair City. An off-street parking spot can cost over $10,000. And so it just makes the cost really accessible for those people. But by not requiring an off-street parking spot for an ADU, but makes it more difficult. So those are a lot of nuances to every piece of the puzzle.
And I'd say, just to piggyback on that, totally true on the ADU front. And we've also found communities that start with an ADU parking requirement often pull it back. But they also don't like what it does aesthetically, because it's like, well, I don't mind the ADU in my neighbor's backyard, but I don't like the extra driveway and garage that the city made them put in. right? Like, I'd rather just see the scape, and so we actually find that neighbors prefer, like, you think in your head as a neighbor, like, oh no, I don't want people parking on the street, until you see that requirement go up, so that's a pretty common second.
I mean, this might be anecdotal, but I used to live on the west side of Denver. And we didn't have a driveway or parking spot in our house.
Yeah,
So everyone parked on the street.
Yep.
And eventually I couldn't park there because people who were living in their cars were parking in front of me. So like, we worry so much about space for cars that now we have people who don't have space for homes
yeah.
living in their
Yeah,
cars
great
on
point.
our streets.
All right, if there are no more questions, we can go on to agenda.
Great, thank you all for your time, it's good to see some of you again, and some of you in person.
Hello, my name is John Voboril. For anyone who doesn't know me, I've worked for the city for over 20 years. I am the city's long-range planner. And so what I'm tasked to do is to look out into the trends of what's going on around the community, around the state in terms of land use, zoning, housing, and transportation. And so this was something in my wheelhouse, looking at affordable housing programs and seeing what is coming along the pike. So I was the person who took on that job to monitor this legislation, to make, and to also see how Englewood might be able to take advantage of these programs and then make sure it was eligible to do so. All right, so let's talk about Proposition 123. This was an initiative where a group of affordable housing advocates statewide came together to promote this initiative, put this on the ballot. Their goal was to get public funding from the state to be dedicated to affordable housing programs. And so that level, what was given to the voters was that, do you agree that 0.1% of all state tax revenue should be dedicated to affordable housing programs? That's all it was on the ballot, just that question. And the voters did approve it. It was not necessarily overwhelming, but it did get a majority and did pass. So then the ball was then passed to the state legislature. So the state legislature, it was their duty to then codify what the program rules were going to look like for this program. And up here, these are the different programs that have been established under Prop 123 funding. The ones in red are ones that are applicable to cities or housing authority. So those are land banking, they take the form of grants and loans. Some of these part of the land banking, concessionary debt to purchase or rehab older apartment units. The equity program, which hasn't been totally developed yet, and planning and regulatory approval capacity grants that certain kind of like the IHOP grant that we got to pay for Mollie's group to do the housing needs assessment. And then the other three are different things for people who build and construct modular and factory built housing. So that doesn't apply to us. And nor does necessarily directly to us apply the affordable homeownership down payment assistance. That goes to people looking to buy homes, and then homelessness assistance programs, which are geared towards service providers. All right, so basically, so it's the state government goes in and figures out, okay, what kind of rules we're going to put around this funding. And of course, they're probably lobbied while they're doing this by some of those affordable housing coalition members as well. But anyway, they came up, there's a carrot and stick approach to this. There's the carrot is all the money that's available, but then they want to have sticks too. And so they want to be able to incentivize, they wanted to make sure that communities would establish goals of how many affordable housing units that they were going to commit to, and then put in a little bit of a penalty if you didn't make that, to kind of incentivize you to make sure you hit your goal. At the same time, they really didn't give you a lot of choices about what your goal was going to be. They basically kind of developed four different choices, and two of them are by default, and two choices are ones that a community would have to do a written justification to get approval for. And so those four choices are your own county area median income, which is specified as family income, or you can choose your neighboring metro area county median income. That's like, you know, Jefferson, Adams, Arapahoe, Denver, Broomfield, the whole metro area, taken together, what that median income is. And then the two justification measures are your neighboring non-metro area county median income. And for Englewood and Arapahoe County, those counties are Washington County and Lincoln County. And those, if you don't know, are way, way out east on the plains. And they, you know, in that situation, they probably aren't really that good of a comparison to our situation here. And may be hard to justify. And then the final choice was the Colorado State median household income. And that's ultimately what we chose. And also, you know, just a little bit about families versus household median income. They're two different things. Families consist of two or more persons that are related by birth, marriage, or adoption. Households, on the other hand, consists of one or more persons occupying the same housing unit. So roommates that are not related or sharing a housing unit are not considered families. And so all families are households, but not all households are families. Families are a smaller subset of the universe of households. And the other thing that's very important here is that family median incomes are generally higher than household median incomes. All right, so based on those four different choices, the Colorado Department of Local Affairs helped us all out by computing for every community in Colorado, using those four different choices. They computed your baseline of your existing affordable housing units, and then applied the 9% increase to that to show you what different levels of affordable units you have to commit to, based on which four choices you made. And they did that through some pretty complicated analysis that included American Community Survey estimates from the census, including household size and income ranges in your community, as well as your housing unit rents and mortgage data in your community. And so this is what they computed for Englewood as our choices. You might not be able to tell very well here, but line 1 and line 3 are the default choices. And so one is your own AMI for your county only, and the top one is the native AMI for the whole metro. And they're dead on. Those don't really differ because Arapahoe County median income is virtually pretty much the same as the whole metro. And so if those two choices were our default, we would have a affordable housing baseline for Englewood of 4,569 units, and applying the 9% increase, that would be 412 units that we need to commit to over 3 years. And so when I looked at that, I thought, oh my God, that seems really difficult for Englewood. The reason why I say that is because there are so few properties that are out there that we can easily acquire, that are cost effective, they're sizable enough to do that. And so that would be a real challenge in 3 years to get to that level. And so I felt in order to be more potentially more successful, we need to get that down a bit. That doesn't mean that that's really what necessarily we should pat ourselves on the back that 170 is all we need to do, we're good. I think we really want to try to get more than that, but this is just for to make sure that we're trying to, we might be able to hit our commitment. And so basically I focused in not on the neighboring Lincoln County, Washington County, because I thought that's a stretch, but I thought the state median income might be a good comparison that could be acceptable and easily justifiable. Under that scenario, we would be committing to 170 units in 3 years. And I thought that's 57 per year. That seems a lot more attainable. And so I went and started gathering data to take a look at different data points that I might be able to use to make that justification. One of those data points is family households as a percentage of all households. And so, as you can see here from these numbers, in Arapahoe County and the state, family households are about 62 to 63% of all the households in those communities. In Englewood, we're a little bit different. We don't have as many families. We have a lot more of these individual households. So families only make up 46.7% of all England households. And then when it comes to median income, I put together all these different figures. I put together England's household median income, their family median income, the counties, two different numbers on that, the state's two different numbers on that. And I was already leaning towards the household income because I think we have more households than families in Englewood. And so the two numbers that seemed that worked out really well, and it's the direction I felt made more sense to go was with the Englewood household median income, which is fairly close to the state household. And so I used those numbers to do a written justification to the state that is what we want to commit to using the state household income data. And with that, Englewood would be committing to 170 units over 3 years. The state accepted that commitment. So now a little bit about what happens if you don't make your commitment. Well, so our commitment due date is December 31st, 2026. That's the time we have to develop 170 units. If it's not met, the local governments will be ineligible to apply for any Prop 123 funding for 2027. However, that after that 1 year is over, we have this ability to go back and make another commitment for a 2-year commitment for a 6% increase and regain eligibility for 2028. So it's not really a super punitive penalty. It just makes you ineligible for a year. Now, I want to talk a little bit about and emphasize about that this money is not going to be necessarily easy to get. So the land banking program opened up last fall. That's the first big pot of money. And basically they got applications statewide that were probably 3 to 4 times as much money as they were requesting that their action was to allocate. And so a lot of people did not get funded. And so this is kind of a synopsis of what the people who applied just in the metro area or kind of I would say our nearest competition. And so who got funded? Well, one city government got funded, City of Orlando. One housing authority got funded, Aurora. We have a number of nonprofits that did get funded. And see, they seem to have kind of a little bit of a leg up on cities and the housing authorities. Cities that did not get funded included Denver, Lakewood, Thornton, Centennial, and yes, Englewood. We tried to put in an application too. We didn't get funded as well. So the conclusion is that these are highly competitive programs, and they really reduce the chances of success. So I came across this as some information from one of the projects that did get funded. which was the Fax Partnership, which is the East Colfax bid. And they were able to purchase the Westford and Sand and Sage hotels on East Colfax for $4.5 million. However, they had a lot of different partners involved to make this happen. They lined up 3 nonprofit lenders. They got a contribution from the city and county of Denver. They were able to get Prop 123 money, but not a whole lot. And they had a contribution from the Gates Community Foundation. And finally, their final partner is Volunteers in America, who will be running temporary homeless shelters in the interim time period before they actually construct the new housing. So what does that mean? If the city wants to utilize these Prop 123 funds, the city's probably going to have to increase our capacity to offer resource contributions in terms of city-owned sites, city funding, and city staffing. We're going to have to facilitate more immediate shovel-ready projects that have a greater chance of being awarded funding. And finally, we're going to have to start pursuing partnerships with the Housing Authority, Downtown Development Authority, businesses, and developers. And that concludes my presentation. Thanks. It does. So if there's any questions I can answer, I'm happy to.
John, if a nonprofit receives funding and they build back our in Englewood, but if we're not getting the funding, the city through it, does it count towards our baseline number?
Yes, it does.
So if Englewood would be able to receive funding, how many dollars are we talking about?
Well, for the land banking program, I think we were at that point, as I recall, the maximum amount you could ask for, I believe, is $5 million. And so we had identified a few sites in Englewood that were currently for sale. And we were hoping I think we identified 4 different sites, and we were hoping to be able to purchase 2 of them. And so we applied for $4.5 million based on the sale prices that were out there.
And how much would the city have to come up as their portion of the?
Well, for this, they did not require any kind of match for this. But from what we've seen with the people who won, they were able to bring different resources to the table that I think swayed the selection of their homes.
One of the things that we heard relative to the land banking application process, the number of communities that applied was pretty high. The total amount that applied for was about $250 million, and plus the amount of funding was about 3. That is okay.
So currently, this is basically off the table for how long?
I'm guessing that this land banking program, it's probably going to be on a yearly basis. So I suspect that particular program will be available again this fall.
Can you talk a little bit about the concessionary debt program? Because the Housing Authority did apply for the concessionary debt. We applied to get a low interest loan through Prop 123. And when we applied for development in Sheridan, there was over $113 million requested. 14.5 million was funded. So it's just this idea too that there is not enough to go around. And I think it's going to be a struggle kind of land banking or to do the concessionary debt program, which basically would finance. It's another vehicle for financing, multifamily developments. And as far as I understand, there's going to be like 2 rounds per year for concessionary debt. So we're going to apply again, but then there'll be a point where how long am I sitting on land that I'm not developing while I apply and get rejected, apply and get rejected, apply and get rejected. So it's not sort of it's not going to solve all the problems. It's very competitive.
It seems to be it would be nice, but highly unlikely for any time relatively soon, meaning several years.
Well, and kind of back to John's point, we heard lots of rumors about how some things were chosen these first couple rounds. And I just don't know if the magic formula, it does seem like partnerships are, gonna give you some high priority, but we had partnered on our, application with the city of Sheridan and had some other funds coming in and had already purchased the land. So we had a partnership and it didn't matter for us. But I think that is gonna be part of creating a really strong application.
Any other questions? All right, so we are going to get ready for a breakout. And what I just want to remind you of, this is your goal while you're here. So a lot of information from the housing needs assessment that will really help inform not only that strategic vision that we're trying to home in on, but also what we're aspiring to do as a task force. And so based on what you just heard, we're going to go through a breakout discussion where we'll collaborate in 4 different groups. And this will just be the task force members, so no staff will be participating in this breakout. Okay, and so I'd love for the task force members just to count off by 4 and 4 that you started to set. And when you do in your groups, I want you to be able to, and we might have to just do groups of three groups, actually. So we'll have 1 scribe, and then we'll have 1 volunteer per group to identify some themes. And basically what you're going to do is you're going to generate some ideas for future recommendations for how the city might position itself for the next Prop 123 opportunity, for the next round of funding. Okay, so you've been given all these different, you've heard all this background, all these insights, and so we want to see what ideas you come up with that you would recommend that the city consider for a future round. Yes, Steve.
So if you get the Prop 123, what, other than getting the money, what's the obligation to the city after that? Are we having to continually do these programs every year to satisfy the demand? Is there other requirements that's coming to the city to have these programs? What's the expense in doing the program?
So my understanding, there's no expense to the city per se, right? Whoever gets the money and develops the units, they have a LURA, a land use restriction agreement to keep it affordable at 60% AMI for, I can't remember, it's 20 or 30 years. And
Do we
that's,
lose taxes out of that?
it depends on who does it. If we built something, we don't pay property taxes, so you would not get taxes from us, but we never pay taxes, so like, we're that from a point for us. Other types of developers may have to pay taxes. But the city isn't really penalized for any of this unless we don't hit the goal. If the city hits the goal, we just continue to have access to the funding. As far as I understand, there really is no impact to the city. So the city opting in creates a vehicle for other developers to come and access the money, but it doesn't hurt the city or hinder the city or tie the city to anything. There are restrictions that are on the property belong to the owner of the property. And the city isn't owning the property in any of these scenarios, unless they are putting something in for land banking to develop later.
So how does the community cover the cost of sewer, police, all of that stuff? If we're not collecting any taxes on that property.
We still pay tap fees, so we'll pay tap fees to tap into the infrastructure. But yes, we just don't pay property tax because that's one of the vehicles we need to keep the properties low. I mean, anybody who does development in this room will tell you that the prices are astronomical. The development we put in for Sheridan for Prop 123, we would barely make any profit. And profit for us is just money we turn into more affordable developments. But the margin was so thin with the cost of development and keeping it capped at 60% AMI and putting in water, sewer and tap and everything else. It's not lucrative. So we need to be able to not pay things like property taxes to keep the developed affordable. But that's like a kind of the bigger discussion we'll have later. to talk about
Like
recommendations.
safety issues, police, fire, all of that.
Right, but that's the city budgeting process. They take that into account, knowing that when we build affordable, we are not going to pay property tax. Or other developers to do affordable developments won't be paying for property taxes. We do a pilot, some of the developments do a pilot too, well, I'll be done. Payment in lieu of taxes. And so some of the developments that we have partnered on that have the property tax exemption because of their partnership with us, pay the pilot to the city. So it's a reduced amount, but it is that payment in lieu of taxes to support all the things we're talking about.
And you're saying it's 20 years is what that,
I can't remember what Prop 123, I can't remember if it's 20 or 30, but it's one of those where it's long-term, and so you are not stuck, but you are at the 60% MI, so you can't raise the rent even if your costs would go up astronomical.
potentially 2 generations.
Joe?
Yeah, I would just add that those developments, the people who live in those developments are still buying products in the city or
Right.
online, which also get sales tax. The vast majority of our revenue comes from sales tax anyway, so they're not zero revenue projects because of the sales tax.
So, somebody else was, okay, okay, so we're gonna get started. So you're clear on what you're going to be discussing in groups, 3 different groups. You're going to try to think of some ideas for how the city might position itself for funding based on the recommendations you heard and the housing needs assessment. Okay, yes.
I might not be sure.
Okay.
Are we saying like these are areas that can be developed in Englewood specifically? Are we talking about like?
You get to, yes, and, right, like, yes, and, you're coming up with ideas, and these may not be, and not every idea may be able to happen, but you're coming up with help generate ideas that ideally you will be able to move them forward and consider them for recommendation amongst you all as a task force. Okay, so 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. All right, so 3 is over here. 2's with Jake. And then 1 is with Corey. Straight out of 3. Okay. 3's over with Jake.
So was I one?
You're 1, yeah, so yeah, you're.
Okay.
I am 2. Or 2, actually there. Okay, I think you're 2. You're 3.
I've got the green, green, right?
Yeah.
Threes are like that, for my town.
You're 1, you're 1.
Shit.
Oh.
All right, so we have 1, 2, 3 is over here. No 3? No, there's another 3.
I thought we were counting groups of
All right, Steve, do you want to be over here? Because we need, so how about?
We have 19, right?
Right. So there's 2
I
right
think
here.
there were 3 actually, there was 1, 2, 3.
Yeah, so we just need 1 person in this group and 1 person with this group. Helen and Steve get to
I
decide.
guess we split.
No, I was there.
Okay, we're together, man.
That's so.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's on that.
So the idea was, right, if you approve.
It's
this
a-
thing, get approved for the building 74.
No, you already.
Yeah.
That's.
You have to build.
Yeah, I'm not.
It doesn't. Yes, like, what did you talk about? No. I might not be doing it. Then you think about the income childcare, so I.
You're trying to put it on how.
You know, I think the fact that then it's talking about.
It's a section.
You want to take like the proposed.
Talk about it.
I love that.
Yeah.
They're gonna look at an application.
What I can have. Funds that.
This person. Performance. And then our state also tells you what. Now, like their partners.
Now I.
That's there. Yeah. Yeah, it was originally 4 and 12. That's how I got.
Yeah, we're already committed.
Yeah. Thanks. I got.
Oh, that's my next round.
Like they've already. They were behind the scenes. Then.
So the one in Sheridan, they're talking about.
Yeah. So I mean, I think, I guess there's,
That's what.
you know, parts of all.
Oh, okay.
But then when they put some, they're asking us to find ways, they,
I wonder if there's any other,
They make.
acquirable,
Nothing but saying.
anything that's sort of derelict,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah. People are excited about it.
Right. And we hear they need the money.
Especially too, like, in transit, I see the frustration from that side.
So we're imagining we're making.
The states.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
How can the city?
Would be a step.
Seems like we have a higher need.
Create more.
Also. Nearby. You can always say, what makes, I say this is what I'm saying. We always have the ability to say, no, we don't. Make sure it's out.
But I guess we're like, right, way. It sounds like it is not a land purchase or development project.
Did you more?
Yeah.
Right.
You still have that money that.
Well, we're,
No, not only.
you know, I know, like, I know Englewood has.
We need to mention how much cities we can guide. Bill number. There's meetings and. Oh, we do.
Think about that.
Yeah, it's like, it's pretty, city, we do have a unique issue with the 6.64. Three square miles. The other choice would be, you know, perhaps. Or rezoning different. So. We don't. We have more problems trying to. Sheridan, they may not be huge, but they have. How do you do it?
Yeah, so you asked.
We could use.
There are some.
How, yeah, we, right, mechanism, we want to. City say. Somehow find a mechanism. Changing law. The city saying. Additional. And I have to exactly.
And we got.
We're not the only. Yeah. Sure, and then way they, you know, city and all. Getting the building costs.
I'm gonna be in Berlin and I didn't know if they were bad.
Yeah.
That's how I feel right now. I don't know.
Such small.
Right. I made a decision about because right there.
Got about 3 minutes.
So. Existing.
We have to make. This thing go on.
Oh, yeah.
There.
One of the questions that go is, land is one of those commodities that people never just get rid of it. They call it problems in the air. That's where. I think we're a small city, it does like. What's that like, no, no, like, we have another consumer build out something. For infrastructure.
Not necessarily like school and filing.
Review this.
Yeah, well, I just read across the street, Greg once, a lot of people. It's cheap and they got.
But we're.
I like it.
Yeah.
With the outline, but
Yeah.
Yeah. Of course, a lot of- Let's see.
But then other than.
You think-
Yeah.
Right. And it's really on that sort of, that's really too, like, it's something that we- Including in our- Hey, possible that's for our- Units that are acceptable.
Yeah. Having a city.
Right.
Oh, well, we had lower median income. And I know they're-
Yeah, we get it.
Median income.
They don't think you can go with like.
Lower,
Are.
yeah, very low.
No.
Yes. I know.
Right, I'm just. Very much think that
You work
the
for-
math is like in.
Oh, really?
I
Oh.
see it matters. About the street. Like the.
I looked at. Kind of all over just.
1 minute to wrap up.
Yeah, my-
That is, oh, yeah.
Especially if it takes certain.
Oh, yeah.
As far as.
Oh, okay.
Like, it sounds like.
Oh, wow, is it that long?
For me, like, when I, we don't want to.
This is.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
We're designating that area.
Oh, cool.
Actually, on the map. And then turn, I see, like,
Oh, yeah.
Instead of the first, it does have a home.
Yeah, I like it.
They would make sure they were like on the computer. Like, right, right, that way.
Yeah, I mean, I think.
It's like, oh, here, sure.
Yeah.
All right, time. So I need the scribes to get ready to share what your groups discussed. So we're gonna start with group 1. So scribe for group 1, what are you gonna do?
What?
What you're gonna do, you are the scribe for group 1, I'm looking at you, so you've been the one who's writing, is that correct? So my ask of you, Corey, is to share with the full group what you all talked about. What you think, how you think the city can best position itself and ideas in this Prop 123 funding in the future, right? And so that's what each scribe will do. So we're going to start with group 1. When you're done presenting, you just go ahead and put your post-it on the wall, like when we did the gallery walk last month. Where you go?
All right, we had, let's see, 5. So kind of obviously identify partnerships. And I think maybe another term is leverage those partnerships, figure out how you can leverage them. Another one is identify opportunities within the city. What is that land? Is that, I just figure out what those opportunities are, identify those so that we can really figure out where the partnerships might fit with the opportunities. I think this one was a really key one, is highlight the unique needs of Englewood. And I think to get a really successful application, you need to show why should you be spending money here? And why is this important? Some of the ones we talked about was, Englewood has a lower median income than a lot of the other surrounding cities. It has a low household, low population. So that
Number of households with people under the.
Right, yeah.
So trying to figure out what is the solution, what are the opportunities based on the unique needs? And then what does Englewood bring to the table? So is that money? Is that zoning? Is that fee waivers? Or what are those things that Englewood can bring to the table? And then really identifying those short and long-term impacts. That is going to fill those unique things.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Can you place that up on the wall for me? Who was the scribe for group 2? Diane, can you report out?
Yeah, so we had very meaningful conversation on each of these topics, so we only came up with 3.
That's, it's not a competition.
I know. So the first is an opportunity, and it's to evaluate the height restrictions in the city to increase density.
Can you say that again?
To evaluate the height restrictions in the city to increase density. Another opportunity was to evaluate unused parking lots. Since the parking requirements have decreased in the city, are there areas that have larger parking lots than they need, and can they be built upon? And then the third one is, should the city consider employer partnerships? Because as employers, we need a place for our employees to live. And I don't know what that means, but
But still, it's a great idea. Great idea. All right, for 3. Who was the scribe? You get to report out. Yes.
So we talked about a few, angles to meeting that 107 million. Talk about providing, or the city being involved in providing additional coverage or assistance in protection for builders defect for affordable development. Anything that's being built for intended for affordable use, some assistance for, builders and developers in that situation. We also talked about similarly, like exploring partnerships and funding sources for developing city properties for affordable units and identifying the properties that could be in the conversation, and what the costs and benefits of each would be, including potential future use for other infrastructure, and just weighing the pros and cons. And then we wrote as well, this was not like a full commitment, but at least the continued consideration of inclusionary zoning policies, because they do seem to be effective in other similar cities, but also expanding the I guess including incentives as well, so that they can offset some of the costs to developers and, tailoring that within the idea, but keeping it on the table.
Perfect. Okay. Thank you. Can you put that on the wall for us? We are not going to do this shortly because I totally feel you all brought very distinct ideas. So this is a really robust list and I love it. So what we'll do with this is I will take note and you will see these ideas again. You'll be able to talk more about this in the future. I'm glad you had a robust conversation. Meaningful, good. All right, so as we wrap up, I just wanted to recap, like, remember when we first were doing the grounding and everyone was kind of saying all of their ideas of what they wanted to hear about, learn about, and admittedly saying, we don't know what we don't know as well. So we're telling you these ideas. And so we've tried to be really conscious. There's been a method to all of this. So really having this grounding established, making sure we're doing our best to include some of these topics that you requested. So far, we feel like we've touched on these Jan 4, Bev 1. And so what I want you to understand is we've got this cadence that's happening. So for the first 3 months, it's a lot of grounding and education. Don't worry about all the details. I'm just trying to help you get a sense where we've had introduction into why, grounding in affordable housing. We're trying to hone in on that strategic vision. And then what we're going to get into is continuing the education cadence. So I just ask you to bear with us as we continue to bring in speakers. It's because we're trying to grow through that foundation, because you're trying to understand these questions with prep work, right? And people who come in to bring clarity of what you're learning. And so this is what we're planning to cover over the next 3 months. So preservation, land making, code incentives. I just want to give you some framing so you can know what to look forward to as we're continuing to do in this education phase. That's what I'm helping you through this first phase. And when we get into June, July, my colleague is going to come in and we'll partner, right? And continuing with that education and start getting more into brainstorming. And so in the June, July months, we'll get into that inclusionary zoning, the still education, regionalization, public-private partnerships, which is something that, is on this list of recommendations. And my colleague is going to start helping to work with you all as a group around how you begin brainstorming. And I will eventually go away, okay? But I'm just brainstorming, I'll be there for that transition that happens. And then that brainstorming continues, and then you start getting more into prioritization. So funding, strategic vision, cohesion of learning. So like I told you, it's okay that we don't have the strategic vision figured out just yet, but we're gonna get there. We'll keep working through that. And then the intention is for the last 3 months of the year, that's where you're gonna start getting into the recommendations that you want to present to parents. You're gonna refine your recommendations. And so Glenna Norville, my colleague, she's gonna be in the trenches working through that with you in breakout sessions, so not really any like people coming in to present to you 2 hours of working together and trying to figure out what those recommendations would be. And then finalizing and aligning your high level recommendations that can be presented and put forward. to Council. Is this helpful to have that clarity of vision and timing? I know you've been kind of working through this grounding. What are we doing? What are we doing? There's been a method. We're just trying to build that education so you can feel more informed when you get to this part. Right? Yes,
The July meeting, was that rescheduled? Because I,
we have not rescheduled that yet, but we will.
it will still be in July?
It will very likely be July, not July 4th, if I could tell you, guarantee you. Absolutely. Any other questions? Chelsea, anything that you'd like to add?
Thank you all.
All right, so, last thing, as you wrap up, I know I'm keeping you probably 2 minutes longer. Actually, yeah, 2 minutes longer, can you bear with me? I wish, I wanted. Okay. So just take one Post-it and pass down the pen. One of each, we'll call it. I wish, I wanted. This is gonna help me understand. And just take one Post of each color, and then pass down. So I want you to reflect on what you liked about today's session, right? Or any, whatever happened today, what you liked. Know what you wished for. So these are just examples. I wish we would have learned about X. Or I wish they would have answered this question. I wish Tasha would have sung some amazing Whitney Houston song. I don't know. And then I wonder, right? What I wonder is, example, I wonder how the task force could be most valuable in this process. And when you're done writing those down, as you leave, if you could just put them on the corresponding, I like, I wish, I wanted. So once you've written it, just put it on the large Post-it and you're free to go. All right? Any questions? Great. Thank you so much for listening and engaging. And I look forward to seeing you again next month.